Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. My name is Corey Olsen, the Tolkien professor, and I am joined, as always, by Maggie Parke, and we have our special guest today. We are very pleased to welcome Daniel Falconer here to Other Minds and Hands to discuss adaptation work today. Maggie, I'll let you take over the introduction.
My pleasure. I mean, I would love to say that we sought Daniel out, but Daniel sought us out. So thank you, Daniel, for coming to find us. But Daniel and I met a couple weeks ago just to have a quick chat, make sure the other one wasn't crazy, right? And it turned into an hour and a half of just falling down the rabbit hole of like, tell me more, because it was so much fun. So yeah, kindred spirit to us at Other Minds and Hands of just kind of thinking thoughtfully about adaptation and the joy of the decisions that you get to make. But I would love you to just give us a little bit of the background of who you are, where you work. We obviously know your vast history, but I would love for you to just kind of lay some of it out to everybody watching and why we're so excited to talk to you right now.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me. I have delighted in listening to you folks discuss your lovely, insightful discussions about Tolkien and about adaptation and about all that kind of stuff. It's so great. It's so fun when you're working on a project, hearing you folks talk about these things, because one, there's the fun game of going, oh wow, they got that. They picked up on that. They nailed it. Yes. Which is again one of the joys of adaptation, is when and in the joys of cinema as an art form anyway, is when you guys pick up on something that and you find a meaning in something that we're like, oh man, I wish we'd thought of that. That's really cool. I think what that speaks to so beautifully is that this is such an interactive media, right? Like it's not like there's right answers and wrong answers. It's art is subjective, and we look for meanings in it, and we find meanings that are personal to us. And whether or not that's necessarily something that somebody on the filmmaking side of it intentionally put in there, or whether it's something that actually just came through organically and other people respond to, no less valid and actually all the more exciting. And it turns it from being a one-way thing into a discussion.
Yes.
And that I get so excited, and that's why I'm addicted to watching your shows, because like such a hoot out of it, and it makes me feel smarter when I watch them too. I'm like, oh, great. So it's wonderful to talk to you both. I've been looking forward to this all week since we'd locked in a date. It's been great.
Well, and I find it really funny because I feel like you're giving us exactly what we've given, or vice versa. We're giving you what you've given us. When you just said like it turns into a discussion, that was our whole purpose.
Yes,
that was our whole goal.
Exactly. So. And just actually to kind of expand a little bit, Daniel, on one of the things that you were just saying. This is something I think it's one of the main things that I really wish people thought about more or understood better. A lot of times I find this is true of books, this is true of cinema, right? The question of author's intention, right? Of like, so many times over the years when I've been doing discussion, I've been doing analysis, whether I'm doing, of Tolkien or something else, like in another English class or something like that, right? And the question that often gets asked is like, well, okay, but do you think Tolkien really meant that? Like, did you think he really intended that? And of course, my answer to the question is simple, but it's easy to misunderstand. Like, my answer is, well, it doesn't actually matter to me whether, because that's not the only question to ask. It's not as if art, when it's made and then when it's consumed, is merely a matter of like, it's not like just like the artist is trying to send us an email and the question is whether or not we received it, right? Like this, there are other ways to do that. Like if you just want to communicate a thing, just, tell people that, right? When you're creating art, you're kind of doing that. Like you can communicate things by art, but it's not just, a book or a movie or something like, it's not just like a particularly inefficient form of communication, right? And so, but often I find when I say things like, well, actually it doesn't, I don't think it is even extremely relevant to the analysis, whether or not it was intended by the author, that often sounds to people like an act of disrespect, right? And it's like, well, no, that's not actually the case. So trying to understand, hearing you talk about it kind of from the other side like that is really exciting, because that's, the work of art is, right? The thing is made. And there are things that you might be trying to say in it. But there are also things that it might say that are almost independent of you, that's the beauty of art, like that's the magic of art. And the way in which I feel that if an artist has the humility to be able to kind of like stand shoulder to shoulder with the viewers, right, with the audience, and look at the thing together, right, and both can kind of grow, as you say, it can be a whole discussion, like both can be enriched by the discovery of what's there, even if it wasn't what you were thinking at the time, or whatever. That is so much more magical than simply like, were you picking up what I was putting down here? And if you're thinking of something different, then that's not okay. I'm going to try to control that. I'm going to try to stop you thinking something, because that's not what I meant by it, and everything. And ultimately that feels to me like a sort of a failure in humility. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some things that are just, as I always say, like in an English class context, like it is true that there are wrong answers to interpretation. Like that's absolutely, some people would be like, there's no wrong answer. No, there are totally wrong answers. Like that's actually, that doesn't mean that everything goes. It doesn't make it just like nebulous and pointless. But there can be a real growth, a real like mutual discovery in the process of a work of art. And I think that's a really magical thing.
I feel like...
Sorry, Maggie, go ahead, please.
I feel like before we dive any farther, we need to give a little bit of background of who Daniel is.
Okay, right.
We haven't actually done that.
Right, true. Fair enough.
So, straight in. I'll get back to that, but I do this is a lovely point. You expressed that so beautifully, Corey. I totally agree. To me, and I think it's true of any form of art, but I think it's doubly true when it's an adaptation, because then there's another element that you're
yes.
drawing, which is that the original story does not belong to the people who are retelling it now.
Yeah.
There's another person involved, the original author as well, and so in that sense, it also almost democratizes it, because it belongs as much to the audience as it does to the makers. And we can all have that conversation about what we're pulling from Tolkien's text, and then what gets presented on screen, which, as you know, and you've so eloquently said many times, is a different medium, and there's so I love all that stuff. It's also, to me, it's the way we keep these things alive. It's not just a story that just gets told once, gets put down, and there's one interpretation, and that's it. The fact that it is a conversation, and we were all having these conversations for decades before there even were film adaptations,
yes.
Is the way that we keep the stories alive and we keep them relevant. And it is important to ask, what is the author's intention? I think that is very, very important, but that's not, as you say, it's not where the conversation stops.
It's not the whole story. Yeah.
And how it's received is at least as important. So anyway, I should jump back now and introduce myself. So look, I'm just a Tolkien nerd that was given the books to read by my mother when I was like 10 or 12. Loved them, fell in love with that world, have been in love with it ever since. And I always hoped, because I drew as a kid, I knew that was a direction I was going to go in life. I always hoped if I could be involved somehow in illustrating that world and drawing Tolkien, that would be a good time, right? That would be awesome. Wouldn't it be nice to do that for a living? And I was lucky enough that after I finished my art degree, I was in the right time in the right place in New Zealand. I was working at Weta Workshop, which is this film special effects company associated with Peter Jackson. And along comes the Lord of the Rings movies. Like I'm a year out of art school, and these
awesome.
Elapse. I'm like, oh my God, I've been preparing my whole short life for this. It was amazing. So I'm so grateful for that opportunity. So I was part of a small team of folks. I was a designer, and so my job as part of this team was to help present visual options for Peter Jackson to look at when he was making his film adaptations of the books, and decide what his version of the world looked like. And that meant lots of research into the books, obviously, of diving back in, trying to, as we say, interpret Tolkien's intent. What was he suggesting? What was he thinking about? And then a lot of interpretation and extrapolation, because he gives you so much, but he doesn't give you everything.
Yeah.
And so we had to find other sources of inspiration for what things could look like. And so you would then look at sometimes what maybe Tolkien's sources might have been, to try and find were there. And then we would also look at real world history and all that kind of stuff, and you know, a dose of just weird imagination and whimsy as well. We would play the same game that I used to play at school with my friends at lunchtimes, and we'd walk around the fields and talk about, oh man, wouldn't it be cool if, and we did that at work. Sat down, oh, wouldn't it be cool if the writers of Rohan carried things that looked like this or that or whatever, and so tremendous fun, an amazing, very, very formative few years. Also because Peter and the other filmmakers hired John Howe and Alan Lee to come and basically kind of provide the mentorship to our very young and inexperienced design team.
Imagine.
So here are these heroes of mine that I grew up with, and now I get to work in an office adjacent to them and learn from them. That was tremendous, and we all learned so much. You know, it was great. I mean, we all started out basically because most of us were fairly young and fairly new to the film and television industry. So we all started out on those films, drawing stuff that looked like, you know, Dungeons and Dragons, because that was our best experience, you know. And then very, very quickly we learned, especially from John, who has a great knowledge of real world weapons and warfare and history and that kind of thing, why things are the way they are, and because Peter was trying to bring a sense of realism and ground his version of the story. Delving into real world history and basing things off, at least in the beginning, off real world historical weaponry and that kind of stuff. Why does armor work the way it is? Why is it the shape it is? What kind of movement that does it allow? That kind of stuff. We learned a lot doing that, and I think that helped ground the whole project. And then we could make whimsical choices into high fantasy where we needed to. Right. But it was from a place of being informed rather than a place of, I don't know, it looks cool. That was amazing. So yeah, I mean, truly grateful. And I had such a good time on that project that I've done my best to try and stay in that world ever since.
Right.
Taking on jobs that allow me to be involved with the licensing of Middle Earth, you know, collectibles, art directed collectibles for Weta Workshop for a long time, writing behind the scenes books, that kind of stuff. Coming back when The Hobbit came along, was also involved in the first season of Rings of Power, and then when the War of the Rohirrim was announced, I, you know, fought my way in on that. It's such a privilege to be in this world and get to play there and talk about it and think about it all the time. I mean, it's been a joy, and it continues to be a joy all these years later. So yeah, it's nearly 30 years that I've been living and playing in Middle Earth. I just pinch myself that I get to do this.
Where do you start? I mean, I just can't even fathom the natural institutional knowledge that you have, you know, like just being in the room where it happens for all those conversations and understanding the process, because, you know, we often talk about process, and I think there's a real lack of understanding of how individual it can be as well. So the fact that you were there for 30 years of the same community's process and understanding that, and I know we're going to talk about War of the Rohirrim and your specific work in it, but like taking all of that knowledge and moving that into a current project and having that influence the new people that are doing their process for these other minds and hands that are creating things within Tolkien, but also within Jackson's world. We have this double adaptation going on, and you're able to speak both languages, you know, like you're able to work with the previous process, help with the new process, and provide all the resources that they need to make that function. That just blows my mind that all of that can be in one person.
No, so cool. But that, I mean, yeah, you've basically encapsulated what my job on the War of the Rohirrim was, which was to provide, because we had for the most part, a new team working on that, with some of us old legacy folks plugged in. But that was my role, was to bring history and be able to illuminate sometimes the whys behind the what, if you know what I mean, you know, because the lovely folks working on the War of the Rohirrim, obviously it's an anime, but so a different medium, but they were looking at the Jackson films, and the creative goal was always to try and fold it into that same universe and make it feel harmonious with those films, just a different visual expression of it, and so they would look at things that we did back 20 years earlier, and I was able to then explain why we made those choices, because that's what films are. That's what television is. It's a series of creative choices. Everything you're choosing this over that, which is always interesting to me as to why this, not that.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, that was one of the tasks I remember when we first began on the Lord of the Rings at the beginning. One of the biggest tasks was to figure out what was the creative scope of this project, what made what was the visual aesthetic of Peter Jackson's Middle Earth versus another filmmaker's version of Middle Earth, Rob Bakshi, for example. And so the initial round of art that we produced back on that project was all about trying to push the boundaries and find out what sits outside, what sits within, how fantastical, how real world, all that kind of stuff. And then being able to take what I learned there and being part of those conversations and then provide that to the War of the Rohirrim crew was really interesting. While at the same time also having new opportunities to learn. I mean, anime is not something I'm trivial with, so it was really fascinating getting to plug in on that project and learn from them. And they were very gracious about the whole thing. One, they were very accepting of ideas. They would run artwork my way that had been produced by other artists and say, hey, this is what we're thinking of. What do you think? As someone who was there on Lord of the Rings, what do you think? Does this rub up against it, or does this feel parsimonious? And they would take on, obviously, I would give my feedback. They would take some of it on. Some things they would change, some things they would push back on. And there was this lovely sort of building. It meant that it was not just trying to copy old voices, it was also adding new ones. And so the choir was growing. And you talked about the generational thing, working with younger artists who, goodness, some of them were barely born when we made their films. And so they grew up with them. And they bring their own interpretation to it, which has been really, really interesting. And then also the East meets West, East meets West thing about it too. The fact that part of the production was based in Japan, part of it was based in Europe, New Zealand, the USA. Bringing all of that together and the different cultural references, folding it all together was really fascinating. And again, another great opportunity for me to learn and grow as an artist as well. And I did get to draw. I wasn't just providing reference. I did get to draw as well, which was good fun. So yeah, it was great.
Well, and you have the book coming out next month, right? You were the artist behind the Art of War of the Rohirrim coming out.
Yep. That was very Philippa Boyens, who is lovely, by the way, and is the reason I'm on the project. She was. I called her as soon as I heard about it and said, "Hey, this sounds really fun," and she's like, "Oh, you should come and join us." I'm like, "Yes, please." But she was the one who also said, look, you've done art books in the past. Why don't you do an art book for this movie? And she was the one that campaigned for the book. So that was great because it meant that after I finished on the project, while everyone else was still working on it, I had 6 months to sort of spend putting together this book and talking to the artists that I'd worked with on the film and mining them for all this information. So yeah, really, really good fun. Yeah, as you say, that comes out in February.
Awesome. I feel like you should walk us through some of the examples that you sent over to me and the stuff that absolutely blew my socks off. So the discussion you had with me about armor and just working with the current artists as well as the past processes and how you kind of navigate that.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, let's do that. So let's bring up an image and we can talk to it.
All right, let me share.
Again, let me
give me permission.
give you permission. Forgot that.
So one of the first things that I had to do on the War of the Rohirrim was basically put together reference packs, going back through the vast archives that we have and have assembled over the years, and pull out all this imagery to share with the Japanese team who didn't have access to all this sort of stuff. So that was really, really fun because the archives at Weta Workshop that I was lucky enough to be able to go through, there's like 600,000 images in there, concept art, photographs like this. And the idea was basically to arm the animation team and the design team in Japan with as much material as they find, as much primary source material from those back in those Lord of the Rings days. So they could look at, for example, this is a Rohirrim Royal Guard suit of armor made by the folks at the Weta Workshop. They could go back into this and, we could provide them with all the pattern work and all the symbology, the heraldry, all that kind of stuff, so that they weren't having to reinvent it. Now, of course, they did add new things, which is great, and that just sort of builds the palette and expands the palette. But also they could derive material straight from this original source reference sources, which I think helps make it feel so harmonious, despite the fact that we're talking anime versus live action. It's still, I don't know about you guys, but when I went to see the film, I thought that it felt very much part of the same world. The music also helped. But we were familiar but different, Rohan, Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that was also lovely that we had this 183 years that you can explain certain differences that you would naturally want to see anyway. It's not going to be exactly the same. We're not copying and pasting. We're reinventing and rediscovering.
It would be kind of boring if I think it was all exactly the same, right?
Yeah.
So interestingly, most of the character designs, the initial round of character designs were already done before I joined the project. So when I came on board, that was another of my early tasks, was to look at the work that had already been done and just give some feedback on it. There was a very talented artist by the name of Stato, based in Korea, who had done beautiful sketches of all the characters. And to be honest, most of those character designs were pretty close to locked down right from the beginning. His initial sketches of most of them, the director responded very, very favorably to, and I could see why, because they were beautiful. They did tend to have slightly more anime high fantasy aesthetic, and so part of my job was to just provide feedback, to just tweak little things here and there, to just nudge them, to keep them back in the Peter Jackson universe. Why does the armor look like this versus like that? Why do they wear full cloaks rather than half capes and things, little things like that, but very, very minimal. I mean, honestly, Stato had kind of nailed these characters first off. So again, providing reference like this was helpful in massaging all that stuff within the established aesthetic. And then also it was about getting back together with some of our older players as well. I mean, the amazing John Howell, Alan Lee both contributed to this project as well. It was just an absolute delight to be working with them again. And also the team at Weta Workshop, the design studio there, which again, by this point, 20 years later, there are a few of the old veterans from the Lord of the Rings days still there, but also a lot of new designers with new ideas and things to offer. So working with all of them and the team in Japan, and with commentary coming back to us from Kamiyama-san, the director, and also Philippa Boyens and others on the project. It was very, very collaborative. I have to say it was one of the most fun film projects to work on. I mean, they're all fun, but this was particularly fun. It was really, really cool. We could look at the sword image perhaps next. So this is Eowyn's sword, for example. Again, these are photographs of the original props from the Lord of the Rings days. This was designed by Warren Mahi, if I'm correct, who was one of my colleagues at Weta Workshop back in the day. The aesthetic of Rohan that we kind of found working together, and it took a little wee while to find it, but John Howell beautifully describes it as Vikings with horses, and it kind of is, but you're also folding in, Celtic and Anglo-Saxon stuff, like kind of grabbed anywhere we found something that was interesting and that related, and in a liberal dosing of horses all over everything, because the Rohirrim love horses. And when you're designing these cultures, you're really looking for ways to cue the audience in on who a character is and tell them something about them, the culture they come from, without the script having to explicitly state it. There's enough dialogue there's enough material that has to be described in dialogue in a film like films like Lord of the Rings already anyway. And there are so many different cultures that the audience is being introduced to, Gondor and Rohan, the dwarves, the elves of different types, hobbits, all that kind of stuff. So as much as possible when we're working on the visuals, if we can make that job easier by creating really strong visual styles for the different cultures that make sense for those different cultures, it just makes it a little bit easier. So an audience member intrinsically knows, without having to even think about it, oh, that person's from Rohan, but that person's from Gondor, just by what they're wearing and the shapes and the animal iconography and their right. Clothing and that sort of thing. And that's very much why we kind of went to town with the horses to a ridiculous degree in Rohan. The primary heraldry that we were using was obviously the Raid Golden Sun emblem of Rohan, and then also the white horse of the House of Ale. And then we put horses on horses on horses. It's a little bit over the top and perhaps a bit unrealistic, but and maybe competitive. But it just helps solidify that. And so obviously that was then going to be something that was going to influence what we were doing in the War of the Rohirrim as well. We wanted that same heavy use of horses, although interestingly, because we also see a few things that we hadn't seen in the original trilogy. We've got, for example, different lords representing different regions in Rohan, and they have the overall horsey imagery, but they also have their own heraldry, which was fun to go and find as well. That is unique to them and helps us distinguish between Lord Thorn and some of the others. Yeah.
I feel like Corey and I are exchanging glances of like, who's going first?
Yeah.
Give you an opportunity to speak, right?
It's just so much fun to have examples like this, though. I mean, so much of what we talk about, world building and plausibility and all these things that are so important in adaptation. And here we are looking exactly at someone that has helped create it and understanding why you did what you did. Like, no one would necessarily notice or care about this specific detail. They're not going to have the ability to zoom in like this on the hilt and the scabbard of Eowyn's sword. But if they did, it better make sense, because if it doesn't work, then you're immediately going to be pulled out of it. So, I remember going to see the exhibit in London of the Lord of the Rings, where you could actually hold the chainmail and, take a look at all of the detail, and just seeing the level, the depth that all of these artists went into made that world so much richer. And it's that I think makes the story come alive, because we're already in it. You're keeping us in it. There's nothing in there to take us out of it. So it's lovely to see that in here.
We were lucky that we had the time to do it. Lord of the Rings had a very long and extended pre-production period, years, which is unusual for a film. And that was partly because the project was in limbo for a while. But fortuitous also in the sense that we had time to develop this kind of stuff, which is a real luxury on a film.
And the community. I mean, you had the support that it was understood that you had to go to this level in order to do honor to the original, or however, the motivation was. But, other directors might have just said, give me a sword.
Right. Most definitely.
Yeah.
John Howe has a lovely quote that I'm stealing from him again, but something he once said was, in terms of talking about detail, something has to go there. It may as well, it takes as much effort to put something meaningful there as it does to put gobbledygook there, right? And so, and again, when you've got Tolkien, he gives you so much, and what he doesn't tell you explicitly, he hints at, and so you go find it, because if you didn't, you're really not doing your job properly.
Yes. That is such an important element. People often talk about, Tolkien will say things like Tolkien worked everything out in detail, and it's like, actually, no, he didn't. But what he does do is provide really good and interesting signposts for the direction you should go in order to discover the thing that goes there, But yeah, one of the things I was really interested in what you were talking about there was thinking of the function on screen, like why you put horses everywhere and stuff, like the job that the design has to accomplish within the storytelling context of the film. And I think this is something that a lot of people don't think about enough, don't realize it. It's one of those adaptation, the medium translation elements that a lot of people, I think, under recognize when they're looking at a film, is that you will depict a person from Rohan, or the armor and weapons of a person from Rohan, in a particular way. Not only the only question you're asking is not, is this how they were represented in the book? Or does Tolkien imply that they were represented? Does this fit exactly what the book says? I mean, of course, those are questions that you're asking, but there's also other things that has to that you need to work out, right? There are other functions that it has. Like, as you say, you need people to understand when you're switching back and forth from one part of the Battle of Pelennor Field to another, you need to be able to see that's a warrior of Rohan right there, and how can you accomplish that? How can you contribute to the storytelling in that way? And that may lead to decisions. I mean, you mentioned the use of horses might possibly be over the top, right? Well, obviously, that's a matter of judgment, but nevertheless, the point is, the reason why you pushed the horse theme to the point where you're wondering maybe if it is over the top or not, right, is because there's a purpose for that. There's a function for that. And I think for people to understand better how visual storytelling in film works, enriches the understanding of adaptation and adaptation choices so much.
And it's such a wonderful visual cue between Jackson's trilogy and War of the Rohirrim that if I step into War of the Rohirrim and I see an opening shot with images like this or the armor or the hall, I know exactly where I am. You know, like you know the depth of where you're going, you know, the people, what they stand for, how they act as a community. So in a first image of a new anime film, to already have all this backstory because of the world you were allowed to build decades ago, that's such a rare gift in an adaptation and such a neat space to start from.
Right. Yeah, true. We could flip to the next slide actually, because I kind of think it feeds into what you're talking about. So
Yes.
here are a collection of sword
I'm like,
concepts.
look at Olwen's sword.
Some of these, not all of these ended up in the final film. I think Hammers, Helms, and Harlets are very, very close, if not almost exactly how they end up in the film. But for example, Hera's a little different. Freyaluf's and Olwen's are a little different. And that's because they were the swords that you see the characters carrying in the final film came from lots of different people's design desks. But these were some of the ones that I, working with John Howe, offered up. So John did all this. He did this wonderful collection of hilt sketches. Just here are like a dozen amazing hilt designs. They all have the Rohan-esque imagery in them, but not necessarily assigned to characters. And so then we kind of looked for characters that they might match, they might fit. And then I had the job of going in and coloring them and putting blades on them and that sort of thing. So yeah, really, really good fun, you know. Hera, for example, her sword's a little smaller because she's a little lighter. She's a slighter character, so she's not going to use a great big heavy thing. For the most part, most of the Rohirrim swords tend to be one-handed. That was again something that we landed on during the Lord of the Rings movies, that it made support across in here, just to keep them different from the big hand and a half or two-handed Gondor swords. And they tended not to have big, gigantic crossguards. So Helms, for example, and Hammers have very narrow ones.
Yes.
Again, that's a stylistic choice. Not necessarily always practical. It's quite good to have a crossguard to protect your hands when you're fighting. But again, sometimes we made these choices for aesthetic reasons, for the sake of making the difference between the different cultures. But yeah, that was super fun. Again, I'm going to say that a lot. I probably need to catch myself, but it was super fun.
Nope, we're in.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is here, because anime is not something that I'm super familiar with, and most of us on the Western side of the project weren't familiar with, the director, Kenji Kamiyama, said to us in the beginning, don't let that be something that hamstrings you. In fact, he actually explicitly stated, just treat this as if it's a live action film. Give me designs just as you would have done for Peter back in the day, and I'll have my team do the translation into anime, you know. Now, that didn't mean that we didn't completely ignore it. We're always thinking about things like how many lines, you know. If you make something really complex, it's going to be hard to animate, so that's not probably a desire. And that was something that I learned as we went along. But ultimately, the choices were theirs at that end of the project, at the Japanese end of the project, on how they would simplify things, how they would translate it into anime, which was fascinating to watch.
I have to. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I like to think that if there was a live action version of the project, that you would retroactively go back the other direction, and that, you know, Helm's sword would look like it does in this concept, for example, even though it looks a little different in the anime version. Sorry, anyway, you were going to say, Maggie?
No, totally, because I mean it's all in the same world. It makes sense that these would exist in whatever way you were depicting them. I just had to ask, why does Olwen's look different? Why is hers green and silver when the others are gold and brown? Yeah?
Fantastic question. So one of the choices that we made when working on the Lord of the Rings movies was to distinguish the royal family of Rohan from the rest of the soldiers and warriors, was that their leather would often, not always, but often have a warmer, richer red hue to it. So the leather, particularly in the the wrappings on the hilts of the swords, we gave them all quite strong, warm red magenta leather. For the most part, there are a couple of exceptions, but whereas the rest of the Rohirrim soldiers tended to have browns and greens and more earthy tones. And that was just to make sure that if you saw the royal family of Rohan in a scene, they would stand out because they were a brighter, you know, richer hue. The adornment on their swords and armor and weaponry is all a little bit more and heavily embellished than perhaps some of the other characters. And so this was a conscious effort in this case to make sure that as a unit, Helm and his immediate household were cohesive. Freyalaf's a little different because he sits just outside it, and then Alduin's was a little more different again. And again, instead of being the bronze and brassy hues, hers are a little more dull, a recognition of the fact she's not one of the royal family, even though she is a surrogate mother to Peta.
Mm-hmm. So one of our viewers, Eric, had a question, which is really, I think, goes back to original decisions made. He was wondering why did you guys decide to make the Rohirrim swords straight instead of curved swords, which are often, often curved swords are thought to work better for cavalry.
Exactly.
Yeah. So was there? I mean, I assume there was discussion about this back then.
Definitely. I can't remember the exact conversation, but I do know that choice of using a curved weapons was something that we definitely leaned into. We had already kind of leaned into that with the elves. Mm-hmm. And again, that's a distinction. We're going to get more granular here, but it was a distinction that we made for the Sylvan elves to tend to have more single-edged curved weapons because we were looking to the east. We were looking to, funnily enough, Japan and other parts of Asia for inspiration there to make it different to the more traditionally European-looking weaponry of, say, Gondor or something like that. But the exception was whenever we were looking back into ancient Gondolin for the likes of Orcrist or Glamdring, or even Sting, those we tended to make straight. But anyway, jumping back to Rohan, because we'd gone curved with the elves and in particular the orcs, because Tolkien talks about the orcs wielding scimitars and that kind of thing. Again, it's an ability to make it visually different. I'm sure there were ways that we could have made Rohirrim swords curved and yet also different to the orcs and the elves. But at the time, that was the choice that was made. We would offer options basically, and that was the job of us as concept artists, as designers, was to offer options. And we would sometimes a handful of drawings, sometimes it would be not thousands, hundreds certainly, dozens definitely. To the director, and he would make the choice of what spoke to him. And in this case, the straight swords spoke to Peter, and he liked them. Yeah. Great question.
Yeah. It comes down to individual choice.
In the end, it's another creative choice being made along the way.
It must be hard for the director, I think, sometimes, because basically their job is to be bombarded with questions from everybody else on the project of, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? What do you think about this? It must be exhausting. I don't know that I could ever be a director, but it's really fun asking the questions. And that's what design is basically coming up with questions to ask to help to an answer for what something finally looks like.
And how long does can that process take? I mean, this is probably not a clear answer. It's more me musing of that process could be very long depending on what questions you're making, because I imagine those questions are also informing the director's decisions and how he's building or she's building the world. That all the questions you're asking, they have to make decisions, and all of a sudden the aesthetic is becoming public. They need to have such a pure understanding of the vision that they're trying to get across that maybe they don't have all the answers because they don't know the questions you're about to ask, but they know the aesthetic. So the questions that you're asking, they have to be able to stay pure to that vision throughout. What I find so interesting about this one is that we have a new director trying to stay true to the previous visions while also managing hundreds of animators to get this across. So I'm glad somebody else was in charge of that. I can only imagine the logistics of distilling this information.
Most definitely.
Yeah. Two quick follow-up questions. One that I have just on the asking the director questions thing. Were there when you're presenting, were there times when you're presenting multiple options to the director, but you feel like a rooting interest? You're. Yeah.
Yes.
You're human.
We're all. I like to think of us as all being. I'm terrible at sports. I don't watch sports, but I like to think of us all as a team.
Right.
And we're all trying to win the game together. but like, sure, everybody wants to be that guy who carries the ball across the line, right? So you put your stuff up on the board, and you can't help but have your favorites. And sometimes they're your own designs, sometimes they're something your colleagues have done. You're like, oh, that's awesome. I hope he picks that. And so you definitely do have a bit of a vested interest sometimes in what the director will choose. And so it's kind of exciting when you pick something. What was lovely about Lord of the Rings was that we all had a pretty even batting average. Like everybody was getting wins. You might get wins in a certain culture more because you just have an affinity for it. Some of us were, the Rohan guys. Some of us were the elf guys. Some of us were the Gondor guys. Some of us were just like, there was one particular dude who just nailed the bad guys every time. And so you tend to then have your areas where you take the lead, and others where you play support for everyone else. But yeah.
Is there ever any like back and forth? Like, is there anyone who, like, the director says, I really like this one, and someone's like, well, like.
Well, he was very. I mean, Peter was. Obviously, the final decision is
right.
his.
Sure.
But we could have dialogue, and
Mm-hmm.
if he came into the room and didn't have a clear idea initially, we would talk. We would talk about it. The opportunity to do so. And sometimes it was a fast process, and sometimes it was longer. It tended to be longer in the beginning.
Yeah.
Because the questions we were asking were bigger, right?
Right. Establishing the basics. Yeah.
It could look like anything. What is the aesthetic, And then later, as we got into it, and we all started to understand the aesthetic because we were seeing things, and particularly once the first film was out, man, everybody could then look at it and go, well, that's what it is.
Yeah.
It makes it easier to answer those questions. So weapons. I'll use weapons for example as an example, but there were weapons that we were designing for much later in the shoot, and those were designed in one drawing. It's like Peter you draw this, and Peter would go, "Yep, that's exactly what I'm after. Good, go." Cool. Whereas in the beginning, you might do many dozens, even hundreds, to get there.
Yeah. So the second follow-up question is from one of our viewers, Meow Indeed, who says, which comes first, the rule of cool or like faithfulness and accuracy? Like when those two things are in conflict, is there a tendency of like, what tends to win out, or to what extent you go in one direction or the other? And
I should just say our whole audience knows about the terrors of the word faithful.
Yes.
So
yeah.
You can compartmentalize that.
Well, I know. I mean, I think it's an interesting question to ask, and I think that everybody working on it would probably have their own individual answer. I know for me personally, because I was first a Tolkien fan, I felt that I had three masters when I was working on the films, in the sense that I had to try and produce something that I felt germane to the story as I understood it, and honoured what I interpreted to be Tolkien's vision. I was obviously beholden to my boss, the director, give him what he wanted, and that he liked. And also, I felt very strongly the responsibility to the viewers as fellow Tolkien fans, but also those who've never read the books before and know nothing about it and are going to discover that world through the films. If you mess it up, you kind of ruin the experience. You know what I mean?
Right.
One, we look like idiots because then my fellow Tolkien fans go, "Why did you do that? That looks terrible. Why did that counted?" So there was always that dance of trying to remain faithful, and then I love the expression, the rule of cool thing. You try to make it look exciting as possible, and obviously Peter's going to go for the stuff that looks the coolest. We had little tricks, and I remember there was a little bit of an arms race. Like initially, we were all drawing in pencil because that's the fastest thing to do, and the object of concept art is to get the idea across as quickly and efficiently as possible, and then move on to the next idea. Because the director would rather have 6 sketches than one fully finished painting, usually,
right.
Because otherwise, then he doesn't have as much choice, right? So we all started off doing pencil sketches. And I remember the day that somebody coloured theirs, and then we're all like, "Oh." We'll probably have to color them now because people are that's the one that's going to grab your eye on the wall first when you're looking at the drawing. So we were like, "Yeah, I see what you did there." So there's that. Peter's got a fantastic eye, and obviously Richard Taylor was leading our design. He's the boss of Weta Workshop, the founder of Weta Workshop, and he also has a fantastic design eye. And so he would counsel us and guide us in advance of Peter coming in once a week to look at our stuff and give his thoughts too. So that we would offer the here's the why we did it this way to be faithful to comment or something like that, and then there was also the but then how cool does it look? And honestly, usually those things were in concert. Like, rarely did they fight each other. I think, and again, somebody correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think there was a note in Tolkien's text about Ents not having knees, for example. Or I can't remember now where that note came from. It may be an oblique reference to something, but I remember that was the interpretation, was Ents don't have knees. But that makes it very difficult for them to walk and not look silly. So our Ents have knees, for example. Now, whether that's a contradiction, again, that's my memory. I could be wrong there, but that's maybe an example where giving them knees is cooler than not having knees.
Yeah, his initial actually it's a really interesting example of where you can kind of go multiple ways in the text. The description of Treebeard walking does sound like he doesn't have knees. But then he explicitly compares the Ents walking to herons, who very much have knees, right? Like very prominent knees involved in the walking of herons. So yeah.
So we'll let that slide.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Should we look at the next
Yeah.
maybe? That might be
We should, but I have a quick question just about this specific piece with War of the Rohirrim, because obviously Peter Jackson was exec on War of the Rohirrim, but he wasn't actively involved in the creative process. Was it primarily you serving as like the font of knowledge of previous Jackson world to the current depiction of it?
Certainly not only me by any means.
Sure.
I was part of that process, but again, we had Alan Lee, we had John Howe, we had some of the veterans of Weta Workshop like Gus Hunter, Greg Tozer. But then also within, on the production side, we had Philippa Boyens, who's an astonishing fount of knowledge, and she had been guiding the script writing process. Her head was already leaping ahead of us in that stuff. And my understanding, I wasn't privy to this, but my understanding is that they would show stuff to Peter periodically for his input as well. So, and in addition to that, there would have been other people in other departments that have that familiarity too. So, and that obviously that wasn't the only yardstick we were trying to measure against. Was not just fidelity to the original films or fidelity to Tolkien. There were other things as well, but there were many people in the process who offered that perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it never feels like it's a slave to the preconceptions. It still feels very fresh in its own mind. So it's just nice to hear how the communication happens between the old and the new, and the new seems to be just fine and have a ton of support, which is pretty great.
So yeah, this is an interesting one. In fact, I think we can jump to. There's another image of Helm's Deep that maybe we can leap. Yeah, this one. So this is a great example. We'll be going backwards and forwards between these two, perhaps, but this is obviously a lovely photograph from back in the Lord of the Rings days of the shooting miniature of Warnberg of Helm's Deep. And it's one of the few images that shows almost the entire bigature, the big shooting miniature. If that person was actually to get up and walk down, they'd probably stand a little taller than the tower. But there's a little bit of perspective involved here. But one I put in here because it's such a beautiful miniature, and it was incredible. That was one of the cool things about being at Weta Workshop on this project, was usually on a film, most departments are single focus. You've got the design, or departments, I should say, departments and companies, third-party companies are focused on a particular thing. One might do miniatures, one might do armor, one might do weapons, one might do costume. Because Workshop touched so many different things, for me as a designer, it was amazing, because if I am having a day where I'm a bit uninspired, all I had to do was go downstairs and walk around and go to the miniatures department and look at this stuff, or go and see the guys, Peter Lyon, our swordsmith. So that was amazing. But anyway, getting back to the point I was trying to make with this, I get distracted.
Welcome.
This is a picture of the shooting miniature of Helm's Deep, and we provided this as reference to the team in Japan who were designing, obviously, helping visualize the new visual of what the Hornburg would look like in Helm's time. And one of the notes that Kamiyama-san had was that we have this big siege at the end of the film, and they wanted to make sure that it wasn't a repeat of what we saw in the Two Towers. There was the risk that it could be very, very similar, match beats and things like that. So they were looking for ways to make it different. Obviously, one of the biggest difference is that Tolkien describes about it happening in the midst of this like horrific winter. Right. So that changes things. So you fill the valley with snow. And also, Kamiyama-san was looking for some kind of ticking clock mechanism, and working with the writers and with Philippa to try and find a way to do that. And the solution that he settled upon was the notion of a siege tower of some kind being built, and that the people of Rohan trapped in the Hornburg would look out and see this thing getting built, and you could count the days, okay, before we're in real trouble here. But once you fill this valley with snow, the wall doesn't look that tall anymore, and it's certainly nowhere near as tall as, for example, the walls of Minas Tirith. So I think from memory, and again, I may be wrong here, so apologies if I get this wrong, but from memory, the wall of the deepening wall is around, I think it's around 6 meters tall, maybe 7, something in that range anyway. But once you start filling it all up with snow, and anime is a slightly heightened medium too, where I think things get a bit exaggerated, so it suddenly didn't feel that tall. And so when we were designing what does the Hornburg look like in Helm's time, the director said, "Oh, I'd like the wall to be taller." And I'm racking my brain like, "Oh my goodness, how do we do this without changing Alan Lee's beautiful design of the Hornburg?" And that's where, again, one of those situations where you're trying to make sure you don't do anything that contradicts the law or makes no sense. Like, there's no reason why the Rohirrim would have shortened the wall, the deepest wall. Time, Theoden's time, you're like, particularly considering that the fortress was built by the Numenoreans centuries earlier. So
yes.
the Rohirrim are really, they might reskin it in some way, by hanging their flag on it and carve something here and there. But for the most part, this is a Numenorian structure. The Rohan aren't doing anything to it.
Right.
So one of the thoughts that we came up with, and this was working with Adam Middleton and the design team of Weta Workshop, was, okay, well, what if, like, we can see this huge scree slope, right? That Éomer and Gandalf ride down at the end of the Two Towers. So we know that this valley, and looking at the soils in the bottom of it, it is all alluvial. We know that this valley is susceptible to erosion. So this is where you start extrapolating. Okay, what if it used to be deeper? And this is where maybe we can jump back to that other image. But so this is a bit of concept. It's literally painting over the image that we saw in the previous frame, changing it into a wintry landscape, and changing it, offering the suggestion of, well, maybe the wall of the valley is lower. So that's how we can get away with the deepening wall being taller, and that in the 200 years in between, it has, through successive floods and other events, it's a stretch, but it's filled up.
And it's really interesting because you can see the slant wall, like the wall that comes down from the citadel to the deepening wall itself. That does not look taller, right? It's the main wall that's taller, which is great because, of course, the diagonal wall is based on rock, right? But the deepening wall is set on the ground. So yeah, you can see the idea where how if the valley floor did rise through erosion, it would be, there would be a whole bunch of that wall underground by the time we get to Helm's Deep. That's really interesting.
And it's it's up to the audience to decide whether that's a solution that works for them or not. I think that's up. Again, we're talking about how subjective this kind of stuff is. That's up for people to decide. That was our creative way of trying to give the director what he needed for storytelling purposes, while honoring the source material and honoring the films that had gone before, and trying to do it in a way that seems believable. And also, it means that it looks a little bit different, which means it's a little bit fresh. It's not just repeating the same thing again. What it gave us, which was kind of fun, was all of a sudden the culvert, which used to be...
I was just going to point that out.
Halfway up the hall. So then it's like, well, why? On the plus side, it gives us the visual of a frozen waterfall, which I think is kind of cool.
Right.
And also, well, what if maybe it's actually a spillover for a reservoir behind the wall, and that maybe that's a water source for the people in the times of a siege. So again, this is just us spinning, making things up, trying to come up with. We're trying to dance between the raindrops a little bit here. The other challenge it throws up is now all of a sudden, well, the causeway has to be a heck of a lot longer to reach ground level.
Yeah.
And that's where there's perhaps a little bit of anime fudgery, in a sense that the angle of that the causeway comes down is maybe a little bit different in this movie than it is in the other movies. But let's chalk that up to a slightly different artistic representation. So my suggestion in this particular concept was, well, maybe it snakes and comes all the way down, and maybe there's even a guard tower that later is buried. They didn't end up going with the guard tower, but they did go with the big snaking causeway. But we looked at it spiraling. We looked at it going in like a viaduct. We looked at all kinds of different things, but it had to be out of the way so that the siege tower could come in off to the side. Interesting enough, it also, like, that causeway was a death trap, for riding up and down.
Don't get your horse to the edge. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it's so much worse now. But again, that speaks to the great horsemanship of the Numenorians who built it and the Rohirrim who've inherited it, right? So
Right.
we're trying to make that to something that makes sense.
Well,
but it does be a very, very dangerous thing to ride up and down.
especially in the wintertime with all the ice and snow.
Details, guys, details.
Maybe that's why the Rohirrim don't come charging out of the Hornburg and try and wipe out the
Right.
wolf snow when they camp down there.
Yeah, you don't want to lead a cavalry charge down that causeway in the ice. Nobody will reach the bottom of the causeway. Yeah.
I think we came up with a new piece of lore together there. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, clearly. Well, and it also helps to explain. I mean, though the sort of the treacherousness of the causeway, I know from my viewer perspective, I was always able to accept that. Like, yeah, if I stop and think about it, I'd be like, well, that's a kind of impractical way to get to the front door. But it's a very defensible way to get to the front door, and it certainly explains why Wolf and his army are in the valley and they're not even working on the gate. Like they don't, it's like out of their considerations. They're doing the tower instead, because you look at that causeway and you're like, we are completely exposed, in narrow files going up here. Think about how we think about how archers from the wall can shoot the totally unprotected people who are going laterally in front of them, right? It's like we've set up this enfilade by the way the natural approach to the front door, right? So it's, and then when you add the ice and snow and everything, it works in that way. Like I was, in my mind, I'm like, it's like the same reason why the terraces of Minas Tirith, are set up the way they are, because like, is that an inconvenient way to lay out your city? Yeah, in some ways, but it's defensible, so it makes sense.
Yep. And again, that proceeds from the text, and it also, obviously, the beautiful designs by Alan Lee from back in the trilogy days.
Yes.
Kind of up for us. But yeah, you lose the advantage of numbers when you've only got a narrow causeway to run up, so and we saw how that worked to Wolf's advantage when he was standing there and just, they could only run up at him one or two at a time, and he's just taken them out. So
right.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just love this because it's another one of those examples of don't need to notice it. You don't have to pay attention to this. But if you ask the question, you would have a full answer. Like, wait, the wall's a different size. Oh my God, that makes sense, because look at this. And there was a reservoir and there was screen. And you even said, like, what kind of erosion the valley had. Like, it's just so nice to know the thought process that goes on behind that, because I think that's one of those things that people think is just really cool, but it's also, no, that is a factor of how this is believable. That's why this adaptation works, is because you're grounding it on such a strong foundation that I can believe everything else because this is so solid. It just helps bring you into that world so much more strongly.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Awesome.
I'll just point out a couple of other little things because they're fun, and the Tolkien loves this. Behind Helm's Deep, you'll see there are sort of terraces in the rock there, and that's from the original design that Alan Lee did. It's in the original miniature that was built, but it's the idea is that is evidence of quarrying, and that you would have seen the Numenorians would have quarried rock from there to build the deeping wall, to build the Hornburg. Obviously, they also tunneled deep into the mountainside, but there's that sort of detail that someone like Alan thinks about and puts in his designs, and so again we carried it across in this, and I even tried to suggest that maybe there would be more quarrying evidence down, and you can see in the bottom left of the image. Again, that's an area that would be covered over in later, but we were looking for somewhere to hide the secret exit from the tunnel that Helm uses to escape. And come out and do his roving in the valley, and so one of the ideas was, well, maybe the landscape's very broken there, where they've been quarrying, and maybe there's something in there. It ended up moving. I think it's up somewhere on the slope in the final film, but that was one idea, was maybe it's down hidden amongst the quarried elements.
Yeah.
I feel like we need one more look to compare these two. I also love looking at this one, I love thinking that somewhere under all that sand and soil is this, just knowing that in an excavation I'd find that, And I don't have to think this is fiction, like it's there.
So that's an interesting thing you say, and it is an interesting analogy, the excavation notion. A lot of the times I've found when I've had the privilege to be working on Tolkien adaptations, there's a little bit of an archaeological approach that comes in sometimes, where you are trying to mine the text for clues to choices that you need to make. And then when the text doesn't give it to you, as I say, directly, you go looking for it elsewhere in related materials. I mean, if you've heard Philippa interviewed, she keeps referencing Anglo-Saxon history and she's referencing, Beowulf and things like that, so that you go mining Tolkien sources to keep it authentic rather than, I think there's always a danger, and it becomes increasingly a danger on intellectual property that goes for a long time, that it becomes very self-referencing, and new people working on it reference just what's been done before rather than look beyond that at the sources. And I think for me personally, you get a more authentic result when you go back into the sources as much as possible. So we always try to do that.
And as you said, Corey, especially with Tolkien, because he's master of detail, but not actual detail, right? He's like the master of extraneous vagueness.
Yes, I mean, Middle-earth accommodates detail brilliantly well, but he did not spend all of his time laying out. In fact, when he began to do that, that's when he didn't finish the Silmarillion, right? I mean, so like all the number tables and stuff that we get in the Nature of Middle-earth, right? Like that's, if he had been, in fact, working out every detail like he was later on trying to do, he never would have finished The Lord of the Rings, right? So, yeah.
But that's a gift for us as readers, right? To look at those books, and he gives you just enough to trigger your imagination and let you fill in the blanks. He's very, very specific when it matters. This is the inscription on this sword, or these are the symbols of this heraldry or whatever. But otherwise, he lets your imagination roam and let you fill in that world yourself. And that's one of the challenges when you're making film adaptation is you have to make specific choices. We have to tie it down to looking a certain way in order to be able to build it. And so we don't have the gift of keeping it vague. And you just hope that the choices you make don't feel wrong somehow. But again, that's all subjective. That's all up to. I remember showing some of the early designs to another designer who wasn't working on the project, with permission, of course, but. And his response was, "Oh, I always imagined hobbits green. That looks weird." And I'm like, "Hobbits are green? What?" And he's like, "Yeah, aren't they?" And I'm like, "I don't know where you got that from." I kind of like it. That's not what our hobbits look like, but it's interesting what we these little impressions that we come away with.
Yes.
Green hobbits. Hey, used to say.
Wasn't Gollum green in that Russian adaptation?
Well, in the Russian film?
Yeah. It's been a long time.
I think he was.
I'm like, I kind of think he might have been green. Anyway, that's where my brain went.
we all love Andy Serkis's Gollum. We all love the Gollum that's in the Lord of the Rings movies, but even that takes some pretty big steps beyond, like, literally, he's not a little black slimy creature with enormous big bug eyes that project light like beams, that are green. He's not. He's this little pink man with blue eyes. I mean, he's actually really different.
Yes, he's very different.
I think he's close enough in nature, if not specifics, that we get with it. And that, again, that's part of what we try to do, is when we have to step beyond the text or contradict it, you try to keep the spirit the same as much as possible so that it still works.
And I think half of it is the thought process behind it. I mean, if anyone's willing to have the discussion with you and not just get mad, that you are able to say, here's what our thought process was, and we did A, B, and C because of 1, 2, and 3. That makes sense. Like you said, you satisfy yourself as the artist, you satisfy the boss who's the director with the creative vision, and honoring Tolkien while also considering reception. Like, that's a lot of juggling, but as long as you can maintain that, you can't control how people are going to react to it. All you can do is say, this is what we did and why we did it, and this is why it makes sense to me. Good luck.
And I really do respect the get mad too, because we're all Tolkien fans, so we all have our own ideas about how this should be, and obviously nobody sets out to try and intentionally contradict something. And when it does happen, because adaptation is a fluid media, fluid process, and things do change. For some people, it's like, okay, I can buy that change. It's okay. That's not a big deal. And for others, there are going to be certain points, myself included, where you're like, nope, hard no, that I don't like that, and that's subjective. And everybody's entitled to their opinion on that kind of stuff. It's entirely fair. But
when you have
again,
a team of thousands of artists, it's inevitable.
Yeah.
But that's why I think it's also fun, because then you can have, as long as everybody's engaging in good faith, you can have these wonderful discussions about the why and the choices, and that's fun.
Yeah. No, it's and the thing that, for me, one of the things, if there's a thing I would love to change, like if there's a thing I would love to be able to help open people's eyes to, it would be the extent to which, like, to get them to distinguish between the perfectly understandable, in fact, totally inevitable personal reaction, the like, I don't like that, right? But to be more self-aware about starting from, I don't like that, and articulating that as, that is unfaithful to Tolkien, because it's unlike my own picture of Tolkien, and so much reaction, so much, this doesn't feel like Tolkien at all, that's not really Middle Earth, like so many of, and that is such a dominant theme of viewer reactions to things. And again, it's not that I'm always trying to push back against that, not because I'm trying to deny people their like freedom to respond to things or to like something or not to like it. But it's that one, in my mind, really critical step, or I guess actually, I suppose, that uncritical step that they're making, to mistake their own personal interpretation of Tolkien for Tolkien's work itself, right? And it's those two things are importantly different.
And sorry.
Go ahead.
It's just such an emotional response, right?
Yeah.
That you go straight, like, anger goes straight to defenses up. So if I'm upset about something, often the immediate reaction is blame and how dare you, as opposed to any kind of other conversation around it. So, I mean, I understand that. I've also had the same reactions to beloved adaptations. So finding the space where you don't go straight to, I have to defend the professor, like, just because you don't like it doesn't mean that's not how Tolkien saw it. It just means there's a conversation to be had. You still don't have to like it. You can just think about why they might have done what they've done.
Yeah, I mean, it is subjective. So I also think, though, that it's important to understand that, well, I can only speak for myself on this side of these projects, but we're trying to present a vision of this world. It's not the only vision.
Right.
And I would never try to presume that what we're presenting is Tolkien's vision.
Right.
That would be incredibly presumptuous. It's going through at least one filter, maybe multiple filters. And hopefully it's not the only expression of this world, and we'll see other adaptations in different media or even film in the future. It's just one expression of it. And people have the right to like or dislike it. That's entirely fair. And I also don't think that we would assume that we always get things. There is a right or wrong. I don't think we always assume that we just get it right. You try, but in the end, this is it's an adaptation, as we keep saying. It's one version of what this world could look like, and obviously, because it's a different medium, there are things that are added that don't proceed from the text. You just hope that you try and do it as faithfully as possible, but it's going to be different, and that's okay. It's all right. The other thing is, who's it made for? Not everything's made for the same audience, I think sometimes we can get lost. I'm talking to myself as a fan here. I'm in my home office and spare room at the moment, so it's full with all my nerdy memorabilia from different fandoms. Just because I'm a fan of a particular intellectual property or film series doesn't mean I have to love every entry or every creative choice that was made in it.
Right.
And that's okay. We're all individuals. We have different tastes. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily always made for me. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
might have been made for my kids. And
Right.
if I see it right, I might have it. And well, what do you like about it? Okay, now I get it. Right, I
Yeah.
understand what you're picking up. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think from that discussion, you have a little bit of perspective. It's nice to be like, oh, okay, I didn't see that. And Corey and I have talked about that with the trilogy many times. That we've learned from each other of which parts I love and he hates, and vice versa, as to, oh, I can see why you like that or why you hate that, and that makes a little bit more sense now. And yeah,
Oh, and I can tell you from the inside as well, when you're working on these things, those same conversations are happening amongst the creatives on the project as well. It's not like it's all one unified creative
right,
vision.
right.
Everybody has entirely different ideas about what things should be, and and opinions. So,
Fair enough. I'm aware that we have about 10 minutes left, so I'm gonna scroll through to this beauty.
Wow.
oh yeah, so this is an example of something that was very early in the project. Again, it doesn't represent the sort of visual style of what the final film was, but it was early on trying to figure out what that style was, and I this is one of my pieces, but this is me trying to learn about anime, and one of the things I learned very quickly was this horse has all these tassels and things hanging
Right.
off
Too
it.
much stuff. Right. Too many. Too many. Yeah. Yeah.
That's a heck of a to animate, but so this design was a suggestion for what Targ's horse might be. Please excuse me, I'm so sorry, I'm having a call come through. Let me just quickly take this for a second.
No worries.
Okay. No problem.
We can talk amongst ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll mute him briefly. Oh, girl.
Yeah. There's it is so fun to think about this, just thinking about the creative decisions, and being on the concept art side of things is really fascinating. The kind of starting, in a sense, those choices, tracing them back to the beginning. Yeah. Daniel, I see you're back.
Sorry about that. I've got somebody to install some equipment soon, so I didn't expect them to call quite now. But anyway,
Understood.
Again, dog babies, we're used to it. It's
yes,
okay.
Exactly.
real life intervenes sometimes. So yes, this was a concept for Targ's warhorse, and it's trying to do a few things. One, it's obviously trying to create something that's particular to Targ. But it's also trying to figure out what is the visual aesthetic of the Dunlendings, because we haven't really seen much from them. There are obviously the hill tribesmen that we see in the Lord of the Rings, the Two Towers, but in this movie we had the chance to develop them a little bit more and show that there's actually a bit of variation. They're not all just these hill tribesmen. There's a more cultured group. There's a more maybe technologically advanced and more well-resourced group that are obviously more closely aligned with Frecker and Wolf, who maybe live in the West March.
Mm-hmm.
So we wanted to show that this is an element where they have some overlap with traditional Rohirrim culture, but then they've also got their own artistic style and look. And the director was quite keen for us to go quite dark with them. He loved the idea of lots of dark greys and dark blues and black in this case. The easy thing when we're trying to figure out a particular cultural iconography, obviously we went horses with Rohan. What can we do for the Dunlendings? The obvious one is Crebain. We know that these black crows that live in Dunland, so maybe we can bring some of that. And so that's what this was trying to do. It was trying to fold in some of the crow's feathers, things like that, or raven's feathers, that kind of stuff. And I kind of like the idea that the horse, maybe when it goes into battle, might have this cowl or something like that, almost more like an executioner's mask or something like that. They didn't go for that, but the reason I included this image, even though it's not necessarily what was in the final film, is that the director was able to look at this and, as any good director can, see the ideas in here that he did like, and obviously winnow out the ones that weren't going to work for practical or simply stylistic choice reasons. But he could look in and say, well, I kind of love the idea of in contrast to the very, very fleet-footed, light, athletic look of the Rohirrim horses, let's give Targ this big, imposing, massive, big, muscly, almost more like a Shire horse or something like that, right? So that did get ported across. So the horse that Targ rides in the movie is very similar to this, but without all the extraneous bits on it. So strip off the armor and the feathery bits and that kind of stuff, and it actually is quite similar to what he ended up riding.
It's so neat to see the weaponry too. I mean, talk about stylistic
Yeah, I was just
decision.
looking at that. Yeah,
Yeah,
I love the Crabine axe. There is really
yeah.
that's really cool looking.
It was definitely all driven by, in this case, because we had the Rohirrim established. What can we do that offers a contrast to them?
Counter.
Yeah, and that often, particularly the cultures that are developed maybe in the second phase of a film, when you've locked down your some of them, for example, Lord of the Rings, the Rohirrim, Gondor, the elves, they all got locked down pretty early. And then we came to groups like the Easterlings or the Haradrim, and suddenly you're like, okay, what can we do that is different from them? And then how do we make that difference make sense? So that again, you pull what you can from what Tolkien gives us. So in the case of the Haradrim, I seem to recall that Tolkien talks about them having banners that are red and black, and you've got snake imagery and things like that. So that's all interesting stuff that you can use. And then that then got us all thinking internally, okay, where do they come from? What materials do they have access to? What do they have in abundance, and what do they have not much of? For the Rohirrim, we'd given them lots of metal, we'd given them lots of leather, that kind of stuff. So then we're like, okay, if they're going to meet the Haradrim, for example, in the Return of the King, let's make them different by saying that they come from a different place. They're from the south, they're from the hotlands. What materials do they have? Maybe, let's say for argument's sake, they don't have access to a lot of metal. Maybe they've got to trade that stuff with I don't know, people in Rune perhaps, or something like that. So let's keep the metal parts minimal for those guys, and instead let's lean into lots of wood. And we're also thinking if they're riding on these huge oliphants, maybe those oliphants themselves are a source of materials for the Haradrim.
Right.
And so that's how we ended up with the Haradrim and the Lord of the Rings wearing armor that's woven out of thick hair. The idea was that's hair from the Mimikil. They use hides as well. Again, Mimikil hide. They use a lot of bone. They got a lot of bone to spare. That kind of stuff.
Yes.
It's all, and then the little bit of metal that they do have tends to be for adornment and to signify, wealth or position within the Haradrim. So we had a couple of guys that had a lot more brass and things like that on them. Those were their leaders, things like that. Those are the kind of conversations we're all having and games we're playing with ourselves to try and create meaning and make thoughtful choices.
Mm-hmm.
And ones that give such strong visual cues. You say it so easily, and when you hear it, you're like, oh yeah, of course. But I think it's one of those things that when you're just watching a film, you don't necessarily notice. You're not looking at it going, good, bad. But that's what our brains are doing. So having such a counter to the Rohirrim, I would glance at this horse and immediately I'm like, nope, not from Rohan. That's all you need, right? Like that is our first impression of this is different. And yup, that is what we're being introduced to, something totally different and new to the world. But it also doesn't look alien to the world. Like there's enough reference there that you can understand that it's in the same space and probably created from the same materials, but didn't notice the Oliphant armor. I mean, that's pretty cool. So
Right.
I'll have to take a look at that one.
It's also, you want contrast, you want them to look visually distinct. But also in the case of the Dunlendings were an interesting one too, because if they were just the hill tribesmen, it kind of feels like a bit of a one-sided fight. You've got the Rohirrim on their horses and they're pretty technologically advanced by comparison to these cavemanish looking dudes. It couldn't just be them. And so I think having a more cultured, more sophisticated group of Dunlendings as well that are more the equal of the Rohirrim, I think is fair.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it just seems a bit mean. I mean, and it is also nuanced. The Rohirrim are already, they are a culture that has displaced these guys, right? Like there is a bit of ambiguity there, and that's one of the things that drew me to the story as well. Is that I kind of like, it's like when you first enter the story, Wolf and Freka, they may be jerks, but they're not unsympathetic jerks in a sense, right? They have grievances.
Yes, they're not completely wrong. Yes.
This film, where the Rohirrim is all about choices. It's about characters and the choices they make, and it's Wolf's choices that ultimately paint him the villain, because he has a choice to do one or the other thing, and he unfortunately always chooses pretty badly. And I think Hama's execution being the ultimate. That's the point to me where he's irredeemable. Right after that,
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know what, you're locked in at that point. Whereas Hera, you know, she's a character that craves freedom. She loves being outdoors, all that kind of stuff. Um, and and you can see she has some freedom at the beginning because she's this young woman, but you can see the walls are coming in around her. There's this marriage, there's politics. It's her choices are going to be constrained, and her choices are very constrained by the time she's trapped in the Warnberg. So I have no idea where I was going with this point, but
I'm here for all of it, because all of a sudden we're winding back to the characters and where they were here, and I'm like, we haven't even talked about plot. I'm just so
right. We've talked about the
on
story.
process. Yeah, like I hope this is conversation 1 of 12.
But yeah, contrast. I think is also, you know, that you want to offer designs that cut different ways for different characters that are representative of the story path that they're on. So yeah, and tying that back to Hedda, seeing as so we will pull it back to the War of the Rohirrim here. When she chooses to don the wedding dress at the end, which again obviously calls back to the beginning. That's right. What Wolf was asking for when he came there, so that's what she's going to give him at the end. But also, I don't know if you caught it, but there are eagle motifs in that wedding
in
dress.
The dress,
which is a little bit, I grant you, is a little bit forced. You know, it's a little bit on the nose. It's coincidence, really.
Right.
But it's a symbol of the freedom that she's looking for as well. So it's a representative of her choice, I suppose. And the fact that she made a choice in going and asking for help from those, begging for help from those eagles, that's not a choice that her father could make.
Right.
That's not what Helm is. He didn't send for aid when maybe he could have, because he's too proud. And his solution is this. This is, he can punch his way out of every problem, as he tries to do. When nothing else works, default to punch my way out. I'll just kill it one at a time. You know?
Right. Yeah, the choice, Hera's choice to consult the eagles, right, to go and supplicate the eagles, as you say, really put herself in the power of the eagles to ask for help. That moment is a really, I'm looking over Maggie's shoulder and her background here, right? That image of Hera standing before the eagle is almost actually a little misleading, right? Because there she looks like she's standing proudly and having, she's obviously much smaller, but if you account for size, she's having a face-to-face, eye-to-eye view with the eagles. Whereas in the film, she's on her knees, right? She is absolutely, on her knees with her head bowed, like the eagle could, she's giving herself without defense to the eagle to kill if it wants to help if it chooses to. The way in which she is opening herself to the eagles there is, I that was one of my favorite elements of the story, was her relationship, where her relationship with the eagles went. The eagles are associated with her freedom in the beginning of the story, in that it is how we see her exercising her freedom, right, is to interact with the eagles and to sort of befriend the eagles. And yet, far from being a means of like escape and achieving her freedom at the end, she surrenders herself to the eagles. It's, you talk about her choices in that moment, like it was her choice to go up there, but once she's up there, she releases, she can't make any choices anymore, right? She puts the choice entirely in the hands of the eagles. So I thought I really liked the shape of that storyline in particular, that sort of sub storyline.
As a fan, I'm with you on that. Obviously I had no part in making those kind of story decisions, and I really hope that you guys have a chance to talk to obviously to Philippa Boyens, but also to Artie Papageorgiou and Phoebe Gettins, the writers, who are lovely people, and I really enjoyed getting to know them on this project. I hope you get to have those conversations with them, because they'll be fascinating, and I'll be tuning in.
Yeah.
We will. Yeah.
No, it's really interesting. It's interesting also because given the symbolic weight of the eagles in Tolkien's works, right? Their association with hope as the film, but like with Eucatastrophe, and with the, they are the, it's not Deus Ex Machina, which is an insulting term, but they are the way. I mean, if there is a way the gods intervene, it is through the eagles, right? That is the mechanism, and so therefore, that moment in the War of the Rohirrim, again, when Hera goes up and then kneels before the eagles, is in its way one of the most indirectly like religious moments in any of the films that I can think of. Like there is a it's not directly religious, but there is a sort of a quasi-religious. There's a it's the closest we've ever seen in a Lord of the Rings story, you know, in a Middle-earth story, to someone simply appealing to the divine, which is, again, it's like, it's not, that's not exactly what's happening there, but it's only one step removed from that. And it's a really interesting element of the story in that way.
I completely agree. And her only way to, like, the eagles remain unknowable in a sense.
Yes.
They're almost reachable. And the only way she can reach to them or appeal to them is essentially to surrender herself to them, you know, to surrender herself to the potential for death.
Yeah.
Which is ultimately what she's story.
But also to go into their space, I liked that she had to push it to a crossing a boundary to a place they wouldn't be comfortable with, and then had to supplicate herself. So there was a real bravery and a push to that point, and then a back end. So yeah, I like that.
Yeah,
duality.
and the way that sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's a different kind of bravery to running out with your sword too.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and she's not running out and defeating armies. She can fight Wolf because she knows how to, because she knows him, and she, you know, they used to spar together as kids, which as they established. So that's within her skill range, but she's not. Yeah, I like that it all proceeds. It didn't step outside of what we know to be her capability as a character.
Right. Mm-hmm. And coming back to that courage again, it's what I like about the introductory scene with the eagles. She interacts with the eagles, and there's something transgressive about that. Like when she comes home and Alwyn's like, "Why are you doing this? That's dangerous," right? You know, and yet we can see there's still this boundary, right? What she's doing is literally throwing something up into the air. Right? They don't come down to her. She doesn't go up to them. There's still this separation in the beginning. She's kind of reaching across the boundary, right, by throwing food up to them. And you know, and it's a sort of gesture of goodwill and everything, but it's not. There's no threshold that's being crossed there. You know, they're very much she's kind of very much reaching out in a very non-intrusive way from a distance, right? With them up in their space in the sky, and her down in her space with her horse on the land, and then of course the courage, the particular flavor of courage, as you say, that she shows, is that willingness to cross the boundary and actually herself enter their space, and the visual image of her scaling, you know, the icy wall in order to get there. You know, it's like that's the kind of thing that you couldn't just walk there. Like if you could just walk, then it wouldn't be crossing up into, you know, eagle space, right? It would be, you'd still be in human space.
It has to be an epic feat, right? You know, to do that.
Yes.
To earn it. Yeah.
And of course, it makes me think of the top of the Minotaur, of course, in Numenor, right? And the eagles come there. And that's like the place where you can walk to the top of the you could walk anyway to the top of the Minotaur, and the eagles would, but see, that was very much the eagles coming down into your space, or like, I mean, that spot, that worship spot at the top of the Minotaur was designed to be this place where you encounter God. Like it was a temple space, right? And that's what all temple spaces are, is this place where the divine and the human connect, right? Or kind of come together. This is not, again, it's not a temple kind of thing. It's not a place that's designed for humans to come, even if, as on the top of the Minotaur, only at certain times and only certain people, right? There are lots of restrictions. Again, as is common with temple spaces, but here it's not. It is. I called it religious, but it's not like that. It's not there. It's not a. There isn't a path. She has to make her own path, and it's transgressive. Just like we got the hint that her interaction with the eagles was unusual, scary. Not recommended, you know, not exactly like illegal or you know, but again, it's breaking categories, breaking boundaries. And then, of course, we get the full breaking of that category.
And a bit presumptive too.
Yes.
Which again, that's part of her character. She does have that element to her as well, which is as much, I think, an asset to her as it also is potentially a foible. But again, all that makes her a dimensional.
Yeah.
Oh, we could do this forever. I'm telling you. But we're also at 11:07.
It's true.
At 07, whatever hour you're in, because we're in 3 different world time zones. But
yes, it's 7 after the particular hour where we're supposed to stop. Yeah, exactly.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to do this. It's so fun.
Well, I genuinely hope this is part 1. I mean, if as much as you want to talk to us, we're always happy to, because obviously, like, you know your Tolkien lore too. I feel like there could just be some really lovely conversations about adaptation choices that you have a lot more insight that would just be really interesting to bring in as examples. But the depth of understanding of where it's coming from too, it makes for a lovely chat. So you are always welcome.
Thank you.
It does, yeah. I mean, the process, thinking about the adaptation process, not as, well, there's one story and we're telling another story, but all of the layers of creative choices that go in. When we talk about adaptation choices, it's so easy to just sort of think about, like, well, this thing happened in the movie, but that thing happened in the book. And it's like, okay, that matters. Like that is a choice, that matters. But there's from all down to, the finest details. These are all choices that are being made, and they're all
your concept art in pencil or in colored pencil. I mean,
right. Yeah. So anyway, it would be really great to look at some specific, some sort of specific instances to kind of, one thing I know for me would be really fascinating is to kind of try to understand a little bit better, like the evolution. I don't know if it would make sense to kind of take a moment in a film, or whether it would to take like a particular character or something like that, and look at, okay, like what was day one, like what is day one of trying to figure out what Helm looks like in the War of the Rohirrim, or what Theoden looked like in the, or Gollum or whatever, and then the process of the accumulation of choices until you get to the screen at the end, and how that's involved. I think understanding the kind of the longitudinal process involved in that, it's so easy. A successful film which draws you in and you feel like you're just there. The more successful a film is, the less aware you are of all those individual choices being made, right?
Yeah.
There's not enough good spheres to be able to talk to artists like yourselves that are doing these kinds of works. That, we're very lucky in university to be able to take an art history class or something like that and go deep into brushstrokes and paint choices and lighting, and to be able to do that with a work like this that involves so many artistic decisions, it's rare and awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, that would be, again, dare I say it, super fun. Let's do that. Would love to. Yeah, to be continued. Yeah, for sure.
Be continued. Awesome. Well, thank you.
Especially once we get your book, then we can troll through it and use those examples. So
right, absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining.
Well, before we go, of course, we should make sure to emphasize our Kickstarter is still going on for our War of the Rohirrim documentary that we are making. We only have 1 week left in that, so we're coming to the home stretch of our Kickstarter there. Strongly urge people to back that if we can. We are looking to put together a really, really fun, contained documentary film in which we're going to be having conversations with a bunch of people as well as doing our own analysis and things. It's going to be a very different and very fun kind of thing. So excited about the partnership with the OneRing.net, working with them on this documentary, which is a new thing for us. There we go. There we go. Excellent.
Thrilled.
Excellent. Yeah. So, I just definitely want to remind people to push them to that. It's this is going to be a groundbreaking project for us and for Rings and Realms in a bunch of different ways.
And we should also mention that the documentary is not going to be straight up on our YouTube. So this
Right.
is how you get the exclusive access. This is a separate project that will be taken to industry channels first. So
Yeah.
it won't be immediately on YouTube like some of our other Rings and Realms projects.
Yeah.
But if you join the party, then you get the insights.
Exactly. Exactly. Yep. Awesome.
Uh,
Very good.
I
Thanks.
would look back.
Thanks, Daniel. Appreciate it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Daniel, again. And we look forward to talking to you again next time.
Thank you. See you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
guys.
Bye now.
Bye.